in the here and now as the church. And yet, at the same time, it is also timeless and spaceless. On Monday night, Cody talked to us about the eternality of our God, and a God who exists outside of space and time. Surely his kingdom exists in that same way as well. And God expects for us to act like it and to live like it. So I'd like to turn your attention to the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. This is Jesus' greatest discourse, and we could spend weeks and weeks and weeks looking at it, but we're not going to because I have 45 minutes. And so instead we're going to confine ourselves to the Beatitudes this evening. During Jesus' lifetime, he spends all this time talking about the kingdom because after he dies, he's not going to have time to give instruction at that point about what the kingdom is like and what you have to do as a citizen. And so even though at the time Jesus is preaching, the kingdom does not yet exist. It only exists in the form as the children of Israel, the kingdom of Judah. These things that he's saying, he's still talking about what he expects of us, of Christians. When we start Matthew chapter 5, verse 1. It says, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil things against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the fathers which were before you. We're going to take these Beatitudes one by one. We're going to look at them. And each of these points is going to involve leaving something of the world in exchange for something divine. We look at our first of these Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This is great. We're starting off strong. We're already talking about the kingdom. He's setting the stage. He's talking about those who are going to be citizens, those who have the right to inherit the kingdom of heaven. And he speaks of this poverty. He says that they are poor in spirit. Now, we can have lots of discussion about what it means to be poor in spirit. And I think Jesus may mean a few different things here, but I want to focus on one. And our point here is leave worldly wealth for the divine kingdom. Leave worldly wealth for a divine kingdom. Now, if you look in Luke's account, Luke records this a little bit differently. He records it in Luke chapter 6, verse 20 as, blessed are you who are poor. Just you who are poor. And you'll notice when you look in other parts of the gospel accounts that Jesus calls his disciples to be actually poor, to be willing to take on an ascetic lifestyle. Jesus himself does not have a home. He's a homeless man. He's a poor man. And they're not needy from circumstance. It's not like they've fallen into this situation. They're needy by choice, by design. They don't have to be poor, but rather they choose to do so that they can focus instead on trusting God and in his care to provide for their needs. Now, this attitude really contrasts the attitude you see in the religious leaders of their day. In Mark chapter 12, 38 through 40, Jesus says, beware of the scribes who desire to go around in long robes. They love greetings in the marketplaces. They love the best seats in the synagogues. They love the best place at feasts. They devour widows' houses, and for a pretense they make long prayers. These will receive a greater condemnation. For these people, serving God is about what you can get out of it. It's not about loving God. It's not about seeking first anything except their own welfare. And Jesus makes a point with himself and with his disciples by rejecting that lifestyle completely. He makes a point of choosing to live at a lower level in order to show that that's not what he cares about. Jesus pronounces a blessing on those who are poor in spirit, and he has to give an explanation here. If you look in the Old Testament, there are a number of these Beatitudes, right? Jesus isn't the first one to come along and make one of these blessed are the, fill in the blank statements. You see them throughout the Old Testament, but usually it's just a statement. It usually doesn't require an explanation because usually it's pretty obvious why they're blessed. But if someone comes along and just says, blessed are the poor, that's not a very meaningful statement. And he adds on this explanation. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. They're not blessed because they're poor. They're blessed because what they're receiving is different. The riches that they're going to receive are a different kind of riches. They're not the riches of the world. It's the kingdom of heaven instead. He's not saying that all of us have to be financially poor, but he's talking about your attitude, a spirit that is unwilling to give up everything that you have. I want you to think about this. When we read about the rich young ruler who was, unwilling to do what Jesus said because he had great possessions. The test in that question is if, not that, but if Jesus came along and told you that, what would you do? If Jesus said, you can follow me, but you have to give up everything you own. You have to sell your house. You have to sell your car. You have to sell your books. You have to get rid of your family photos. You have to live a totally stripped down lifestyle. If Jesus said that to you, what would you do? Would you take a step back and say, I'm going to need to think about that? Where are your priorities? In Matthew 5, verse 4, Jesus says, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. What is it that we're mourning over? We can mourn over all sorts of things, and usually the things that cause us to mourn, they're not usually positive things. I mean, that's why it's mourning. Right? You might cry tears of joy, but you wouldn't say that you're mourning tears of joy. That'd be rather strange. You wouldn't say that. When you're talking about mourning, this is in response to something negative, something that's happened. And usually the sort of things that cause us to mourn, that cause us to weep in sorrow, we mourn over pain and loss, whether the people in our lives or relationships. We mourn terrible decisions that we have made that we can't take back. We can't reverse those things, and they weigh on us for years and years. We mourn the relationships that once were friendships that we have that have just crumbled and deteriorated. We mourn because of the pain and the sin in the world and the consequences of it. We mourn because of our own sin. And what's really interesting is that all of those things cause God to mourn too. God mourns over all of those same things. And you can look throughout Scripture and you can see that God has the same attitude and he feels that pain within himself. Joy cannot come out of the world and what it has to offer. We're never going to find pleasure in what we see here. And Jesus calls here for his disciples, for kingdom citizens to leave instant gratification for divine joy. Leave that behind and seek joy in the Lord. With each of these, we see Jesus calling his disciples out of the world, out of the culture, out of society, and out of what I want, out of what you want, and instead calling us toward what God wants. In Hebrews 11, 24 through 26, we have this wonderful testament to Moses. The Hebrews writer says that Moses, by faith, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. We're not going to find joy and comfort in boastfulness. We're not going to find it in the bottom of a glass. We're not going to find it in illicit relationships. We're going to find joy and comfort in Jesus, in a Savior who promises us eternal, lasting comfort. Verse 5, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Leave temporary prosperity for divine fulfillment. And you notice it's getting a little bit deeper each time. Meekness is a pretty difficult concept to define, and one of the explanations that usually comes out is we'll say that it's strength or power under control. And that's close, but it's still not deep enough. Meekness is more than that. When you look at the way meekness plays out, it's hard to just give it a definition, and it helps to have an example. And so I'll give you two examples. The first one, if I were to ask you, who was the meekest man in all the earth? Read that was Moses. You may remember that. But that isn't just said out of the blue. It's said in a context. And we read that in Numbers chapter 12. I was looking down at my paper and I lost my place. It comes from Numbers chapter 12, and it's stated after Moses' own brother and sister slander him in front of the whole nation for marrying an Ethiopian woman. In the face of that shame and humiliation, being treated that way, completely unjust, completely unfair. And in the face of that, we read that Moses was the meekest man in all the earth. Because he didn't retaliate. He didn't respond. He didn't have a quick comeback. He didn't have well, I got you back. There was nothing. And instead, he simply trusted in the Lord. He lets God intervene and deal with Miriam and Aaron instead of trying to deal with it himself. The second example, shouldn't surprise you, is Jesus. When Jesus stands in the court of Pilate, Matthew chapter 27, verses 11 through 14, he stands before Pilate, the governor. It says, Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor questioned him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Now, the accusation that the chief priests and elders are bringing against him is that he's a blasphemer. That he said he was going to tear down the temple and destroy everything. That he's preaching out against Moses, and he's rejecting all of the law, and they're making all these false accusations. And Jesus has every right in the world to speak up for himself. He remained silent. Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many things they testify against you?" And he did not answer him with regard to even a single charge. So the governor was quite amazed. Jesus does the same thing that Moses does. He waives his right to justice. He waives his right to fairness by controlling his emotions and instead trusting in God to provide the vindication. Now, people who embody this attitude of meekness, they get told things like, don't you know that you're never going to get ahead in life like that? Don't you know that sometimes you have to get your hands dirty? Don't you know that people are just going to walk all over you? That's the kind of things that people say to those who are meek. But Jesus makes a promise to those who are instead willing to keep their hands pure. To those who keep their emotions and their attitude in check. They will inherit the earth. People say you can't get ahead. Sure, you can't get ahead in this life. That's because this life is full of corruption and wickedness, and it works according to its own rules. But those who abide by God's rules, by God's laws, will inherit what he has promised for them. We have a special confidence knowing that we are heirs of God himself, that the whole earth is his possession. And if you're willing to give up the success, the prosperity, the wealth, the vindication that the world offers, God will offer you so much more, but later. I want you to notice the tense of these words. In verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So Jesus is saying here, there are promises that you will receive here and now, but some of these you're just going to have to wait for. You're not going to receive, you may or may not receive comfort here and now. You may or may not receive prosperity in the here and now. But God has these things saved up for you. Okay, verse 6. We're doing okay on time, surprisingly. Verse 6, blessed are they which hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Now, by saying, they which hunger and thirst after righteousness, Jesus implies that there is another group, that there is a group who does not hunger and thirst after righteousness. Now, what is Jesus doing with all of this? What is he doing with this entire section, the entire Sermon on the Mount? He's contrasting what they're used to seeing as the pinnacle of religion. He's contrasting the scribes, the Pharisees, their interpretation, their application of what God has said, with true righteousness, true holiness. He's making this comparison, this contrast. He says, okay, I mean, it's almost a jab, right? He's saying they don't hunger and thirst after righteousness. That's not what they care about. But that's what I expect from you. Amen. The Pharisees often failed to see their spiritual insufficiencies. They didn't see themselves in need. They didn't see themselves as those who were deficient spiritually. In Luke 18, I will never stop reading this passage because it's so important for us to hear. It's so important. Luke 18, 9 through 14. He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. And the Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, and even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all I get. But the tax collector standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. Be merciful to me. Why? Because he knows who he is. Jesus says, I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but he who humbles himself will be exalted. Amen. This self-righteous attitude claims to find value in works beyond their true worth. It's not that God didn't want them fasting or wasn't pleased with the act of fasting or the act of tithing. God asked for those things, and he spoke well of them. But they weren't doing it because they sought after righteousness. They were doing it because they cared about the praise of men. Jesus promises that the one who truly hungers and thirsts and seeks after righteousness will be filled, but not before he hungers. You have to recognize that you're hungry before you start eating. Our righteousness is not our own. It is an attribution which God grants us based on our faith, as we see in Philippians 3, verses 7 through 9. As long as we trust in ourselves to provide that, as long as we look to ourselves and lift ourselves up, we're never going to find what we seek. We're going to wander around forever, spiritually hungry. Leave this self-righteousness for divine approval instead. Only God can provide these things. Turn your back on the world and instead embrace the divine. Submit to Christ. Give him everything. Verse 7. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. I think this one's very, very similar to verse 5, which speaks about the meek. Mercy is a trait that we value. We would always, if we talk about mercy, mercy is a good thing. But in Jesus' day, it wasn't so. They didn't think of mercy as being a good thing. It was not something that was considered honorable. Instead, extending mercy was considered a weakness. And later on in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is going to have to give some instruction about mercy instead of seeking vengeance or retribution. You see this at the end of chapter 5 when Jesus says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, which was intended as a cap on punishment. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks of you, and do not turn away from him who wants to borrow from you. We can also see the anti-mercy attitude in Luke chapter 10, where Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan, where in that story you can see that there's almost this contempt for what happens. That the priest and the Levite, it's almost like they take pride in refusing to show mercy because it's beneath them. And why is it that mercy is seen as being so dangerous? Why is it that people are afraid to show mercy? It's because it requires a level of vulnerability. It requires you to step down to someone else's level. It requires you to humble yourself. Mercy requires for you to help people who are in low situations. Mercy means that you're around sinners. It means that you're around people whose lives aren't all together. It means that other Christians are probably going to judge you for the people that you spend time with or situations you may find yourself in. You cannot be a truly merciful person if you are concerned, if you're obsessed with appearances. You look at Jesus, and he was frequently criticized for hanging out with prostitutes, sinners, and tax collectors, even though he was working to help them. It was not that he was supporting their activities. He was working to help them. He knew what he was doing. But sometimes people don't care. Sometimes people say something anyway. And although Jesus knew that what he was doing was right, it still cost him the social dignity that the religious elite cared so much about. And that was the reason why they were never going to do what Jesus did. But Jesus instead calls for us to be merciful. Because we seek to obtain mercy ourselves. Verse 8. Blessed are the pure in heart. Leave external showmanship for divine fellowship. Another criticism that the Pharisees and scribes brought to Jesus was that he and his disciples didn't wash their hands before they. And the reason they cared about this is because, at least as they saw it, who knows where your hands had been, and you were going to touch this food, and now you were going to eat it. I mean, you were putting your ceremonial cleanliness in danger. I mean, this was a big deal, at least in their minds. But again, it's superficial. There was no instruction about this kind of behavior in the law, and they saw this as being incredibly important. But Jesus instead rebuked them for this. In Mark chapter 7, verses 6 through 8, he said to them, "Rightly did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written. This people honors me with their lips, with their words. You say all these things like you really care about what God has to say, but their heart is far from me. In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the precepts of men, neglecting the commandment of God, you hold to the tradition of men." And Jesus says that we are going to be blessed if we are pure in heart. Not just pure with our words, not just pure with our behavior, but pure in heart. Purity is important to God. He cares about us having a pure lifestyle, pure actions, pure words, pure thoughts, but only if they come from a pure mind and a pure heart. Conversely, if instead of focusing first, notice the first part, instead of focusing first on the externals, and you cultivate a pure heart and a pure mind, it's going to display as pure behavior. You're going to do what's right. And if you get these things in the right order, you're going to be pleasing to God. God does not need for us to prove anything to him. Our holy and righteous lifestyle isn't about making a scene for any kind of audience. We're not making a scene for other people, but we're also not making a scene for God. Now, I wonder, and the reason I wonder is because I know it's true for me. There are times where, I'm at home, no one's around, and, I'm doing something I know is right, but it's still a show. I'm still not really doing it for the right reason. Just because you're not showing off to men doesn't mean you're not showing off. But God isn't fooled by you showing off in secret either. He still cares about your heart. He calls for us to be renewed in our inner man. 2 Corinthians 4:16 through 18. And Jesus says we're only going to see God if we have this perfect purity. We can see God now. We can know him now through our relationship with him, if our hearts and our motives are pure. But if we wish to truly see God, to see him as he is, to be with him eternally, that will only happen if we remain faithful to the end. Verse 9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Leave this self-assertion for a divine family. What do I mean by self-assertion? This is not the same as, the self-righteousness, but self-assertion. What is it that causes conflict? Conflict doesn't happen if everyone is willing to let someone else go first. It doesn't happen. That's not where conflict comes from. We're talking about bad conflicts here, right? Inappropriate conflicts. In the time of Jesus, the Jews did not have peace amongst themselves. They had broken themselves up into all these different groups of people. Some of them got along sometimes. Some of them didn't get along ever. And it was kind of a religious free-for-all. I mean, you've got the Pharisees, and they've got some overlap with the scribes. You've got the Sadducees and the priests who have a lot of overlap. And somewhere in the middle, you've got the doctors of the law. Whatever they may refer to at any given time. And they didn't hardly agree on anything. Even the Pharisees didn't all agree with one another. They would pick their favorite rabbi and they would go with everything he said, but maybe they'd disagree. And they had all these fights with one another all the time. And although they were brothers both nationally and spiritually, they sure didn't act like it. The idea of unity, the idea of peace, it meant nothing to them. They didn't care about that. Jesus intends for us to be peaceable individuals. He expects for us, first of all, to not start these things. Don't start these quarrels or disagreements. Now, while they thought that it made them more religious to have, the more disagreements you can have, the more religious you are, Jesus expects for his citizens to get along. In Romans chapter 12, verses 14 through 21, Paul gives this wonderful exposition. I think it's actually an exposition of the Sermon on the Mount. But he says, "Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Be of the same mind toward one another. Do not be haughty in mind. Do not be lifted up, but associate with the lowly. Do not be wise in your own estimation. Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Respect what is right in the sight of all men. If possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire upon his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Peace never happens if someone isn't willing to stop fighting. That's the first step. But once we're in it, we start, well, I'm already in this. They started it. They were the first one to call me a name. Can you believe what they did, what they said about my family? I mean, I understand things can be very hurtful. But God calls us not just to be the ones who don't start it, but to be peacemakers. We have to produce peace, first in our own relationships, but also among others as well. Peaceful behavior does not mean passivity. That's not what he's calling. The process of making peace isn't easy. It's very hard. And if you've ever tried to mediate between people, you know that it requires a lot of time, a lot of effort, and it sure does require a lot of patience. But if we always place our own will, our own needs above other people, we're never going to get there. We're never going to produce peace. But instead, when we learn to think like Jesus, to bear the cross, and refuse or to allow a great division that is not demanded by God's holiness, then we too can create peace. I want to think about Paul very quickly as an example of this. In the book of Philippians, he writes, and he has a whole section in chapter 4 where he's trying to broker peace between two ladies in the congregation there, Euodia and Syntyche. In the letter to Philemon, he writes to Philemon, this is the purpose of the whole letter, to make sure that there's peace between Philemon and his runaway slave Onesimus. In 2 Corinthians, he works to restore the congregation in fellowship with one of their brethren who has repented of his sins and is trying to come back, and they refuse to allow it. And these are not relationships he's in the middle of. Paul could absolutely have gotten away, so to speak. He could have gotten away and never sang a thing. But that wouldn't make him a peacemaker. And Jesus calls for his citizens to be peacemakers because he wants peace and unity in his kingdom among his citizens. And it's because we're not just a nation, we're a family. We are a family with Christ as our head. And he wants for us to act like we're a family. Which is one of the beautiful things about this week, is seeing my brothers and sisters from so many congregations around here and seeing us all come together and enjoy the fellowship and the family that we have. All right. We're getting close on time, but we're doing all right. We got one left. Verses 10 through 12. Leave earthly comfort for a divine eternity. He's already called for us to give up the seeking of pleasure, the seeking of riches, seeking comfort in the world. But now, this really takes us a leap forward. Now Jesus is saying something really crazy. This is about the craziest thing that you can say, is I want you to embrace people tearing you down constantly. People hunting you down and trying to kill you. And in fact, I want you to get excited about this. This is really one of the craziest things that Jesus could possibly say. But he means it and every word of it. Because the process of sacrificing our foothold in this world requires the utmost. He doesn't want us to give up the world a little bit. He doesn't want us to give up the world a lot. He wants us to give up the world completely. That really and truly, this world means nothing to us. Because we're focused on heaven. It's not saying don't fulfill your obligations in this life. He's not saying that. I'm not saying that. He's saying that your focus has a place it needs to be. We've already seen that righteousness is not something that we produce, but it's an effect. It's God's perception of our faith. We're always trying to be more and more righteous, to be more and more holy. But the truth is, we're always going to fall short. We're never going to accomplish what Jesus accomplished, which is why he did it. But Jesus still expects for us to try. He's still the standard. He still tells them down in verse 20 that unless their righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven. You're not going to make it. This is going to require some effort. It's going to require some hard work. It's going to cost you. You're going to be persecuted. I found this list some time ago from John Piper, and I want to read it because I really like it. If you cherish chastity, your life will be an attack on people's love for free sex. If you embrace temperance, your life will be a statement against the love of alcohol. If you live simply and happily, you will show the folly of luxury. If you walk humbly with your God, you will expose the evil of pride. If you are punctual and thorough in your dealings, you will lay open the inferiority of laziness and negligence. If you speak with compassion, you will throw callousness into sharp relief. If you are serious, you will make the flippant look foolish instead of clever. And if you are spiritually minded, you will expose the worldly mindedness of those around you. Jesus says you cannot live faithfully as a Christian and expect to live a life of comfort. You can't expect it. Doesn't mean that God might bless, it's not possible that God might bless you with a life of comfort. It doesn't mean that God isn't going to take care of you and comfort you. God promises to do those things. But he does not promise that you're going to have an easy life or even a pleasant life. The pleasure of serving Christ is completely different from the pleasures of the world. The joy that he gives us is completely different from the joy that the earth provides. And righteousness means giving up, renouncing completely all of the things that are here. And I appreciate so much that Jesus reminds us of the prophets, of whom we can read. Jesus does not tell us to rejoice in vain. He does not tell us to rejoice as one of those things that people just say. You're going through a hard time, and people will tell you, well, maybe there's a silver lining. Well, there's a bright side to this. God has something bigger in mind. And those things may be true, they are true, but it means so much more coming from Jesus. It means more because he really did suffer. He lived this. He lived all of these things that we've just read. Jesus experienced persecution his entire life. And he could truly say that it was something that you could rejoice in. And he did. And I leave you with these words because I can't add to anything Jesus said. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. If you have any need, please come while we stand and sing.